Every November 11th, we pause to remember. But what if what we are remembering has already been hijacked? What if, lest we forget, quietly became a call to fight again? On November 11th, we pause, the nation itself inhales, 2 minutes of silence, a brass bugle, the faint shuffle of boots, lest we forget. The words fall with the weight of law, and yet the whole thing feels precarious now, doesn't it? There's a movement, quiet, polite, and almost embarrassed, that suggests that maybe, just maybe, Remembrance Day is problematic. The logic goes, the ceremony, for all its solemnity, smuggles in a soft nationalism, a faint smell of khaki and glory. People who hold this view tend not to say it aloud. To do so in Canada is to mark oneself an apostate, a social leper. You might as well announce at the cenotaph that you support cluster bombs. And yet, the suspicion lingers. Does our ritual of mourning double as a rehearsal for future wars? Is Remembrance Day a memorial or recruitment poster with better lighting? Let's be fair. The intent historically has been clear enough. The Great War had just ended, and never again was the phrase of the hour. Never again the trenches, never again the gas. But the ink on the armistice had barely dried before again arrived, louder, bloodier, industrialized. If the first war was the end of innocence, the second was the end of illusion. The Canadian version of Remembrance has always carried a certain Presbyterian gloom. Our ceremonies are small, damp, and dignified. Old men in blazers, school children reciting McCrae, the CBC voiceovers murmuring about sacrifice. There's something honest about it, or at least un-American, because down south on Veterans Day, the tone changes entirely. At Arlington Cemetery, if you watched it this past year, the president appeared not as a mourner, but as a mascot. There's talk of strength, greatness, victory, legacy. Generals gleamed like movie stars. The speechwriters are hard at work turning loss into momentum. The day becomes an advertisement for the next war, a kind of state-sponsored nostalgia for moral clarity. You can almost hear the subtext humming under the rhetoric. Our wars were just. Our soldiers were right. And by God, we'd do it again. That's the American style of remembrance. Strut, salute, sell. The Canadian style, by contrast, is diffident, guilt-tinged, a little apologetic, but even here the infection seeps in. One hears the occasional mutter from the podium, "The world is dangerous. Canada must be ready. We're the best country in the world." The crowd nods, polite, vaguely proud, and there it is, the pivot from grief to glory. And then, inevitably, someone reads in Flanders Fields. Ah, McCrae, the physician-poet of the Western Front, a man who stitched wounds by day and verse by night. The poem is practically our national scripture in Canada. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. The first two stanzas are heartbreak made metrical. The larks singing, the guns rumbling, the dead speaking softly. But then comes that final fateful turn. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. That stanza has always been the problem. The dead, having risen in the imagination, so to speak, immediately start issuing orders. Take up our quarrel, they say. Keep fighting, keep killing. The pity of war becomes its propaganda. McCrae, poor man, probably didn't see it that way. He was writing inside the storm, not above it. His biographer says he thought the poem merely showed where duty lay. But duty in that context meant more war. So what exactly are we meant to take up? Is it vengeance, justice, a moral torch? The line trembles with ambiguity. McCrae may have been calling for perseverance in the face of loss, not bloodlust. But poetry, like politics, rarely survives its interpreters. Once the words enter the public bloodstream, they mutate. The foe becomes the next enemy, the torch becomes a rifle, and so our most famous anti-war elegy doubles as a recruiting slogan. You can see why modern critics squirm. Remembrance, they argue, too easily slides into romance. The poppy becomes not a wound, but a badge of belonging. It's patriotism in drag. Mourning disguised as morale. Yet, to condemn the day outright feels too easy, doesn't it? Human beings are sentimental creatures. We are. We build altars out of contradictions. The impulse to honor courage and the impulse to abhor violence exist in the same breath. The whole of Remembrance Day is built on that very paradox. We say never again, but we whisper it with pride in the ones who did. Perhaps the truer anthem of the aftermath isn't McCrae's tidy quatrains, but Yeats's ragged prophecy from the Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. That's the real sound of post-war Europe. The falcon gone feral, the human voice drowned out by its own machines. Yeats saw that something deeper had broken, not just nations, but meaning itself. The old moral compasses were spinning uselessly. Compared to that cosmic shattering, McCrae's tidy exhortation feels almost quaint. A surgeon's optimism in the face of an amputation. And here we are, a century later, still pinning the poppy, still mouthing lest we forget, as though repetition were remembrance. Maybe the phrase should be reversed, lest we remember too simply, because the danger isn't forgetting, it's remembering badly. When I watch the ceremony, I see two audiences occupying the same silence. There are the veterans, the few still alive, eyes closed, remembering the smell of cordite, the mud in their teeth, the faces gone, their silence is heavy. Then there are the politicians, the pundits, the comfortable class. Their silence is strategic, a pause before the next declaration of support for our troops. The first silence says, never again. The second says, when necessary. This is not hypocrisy so much as human limitation. We can't sustain pure mourning for long. We metabolize it into meaning, and meaning, in the national context, always drifts toward pride. Even tragedy becomes a brand. So where does that leave Remembrance Day? Caught, perhaps, eternally between elegy and enlistment. To abandon it would be a moral loss, to lapse into forgetfulness, but to sanctify it without critique is to turn memory into myth. Maybe the answer is to read in Flanders Fields against itself, to hear in McCrae's call not the voice of the recruiting sergeant, but the voice of a haunted man trying to make sense of senselessness. When he wrote, "If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep," perhaps the faith he meant wasn't in war at all, but in peace, in the idea that living could build a world where such poems needn't be written. That's the real quarrel to take up, not with some enemy across a trench, but with the human tendency to forget what war actually is once it's over. The quarrel is with comfort, with complacency, with the urge to make horror sound noble. Remembrance Day, if it means anything at all, should be an act of dissonance, a national moment to feel both pride and shame at once, to remember that courage is not the same thing as righteousness, to remember that the falcon, once loosed, rarely finds its way home.